This lesson introduces the geological timescale, or GTS, basically Earth's history organized into a structured timeline. The key idea is that Earth's surface, atmosphere, oceans, and life have all changed dramatically, but those changes happened over immense spans of time. So we need a consistent way to divide and talk about deep time, from about 4,540 million years ago all the way to today.
The geological timescale divides and chronicles Earth's evolutionary history. Importantly, the boundaries between time units are not arbitrary. They're tied to definite events that caused major shifts in Earth's physical state, chemical environment, and biological life. For example, a big change in atmospheric composition, a mass extinction, or a major reorganization of continents can all define transitions in the timescale.
Because Earth's biggest changes take place over millions of years, the geological timescale commonly uses MYA, meaning million years ago. So when you see something like 541 MYA, that's a point on the timeline 541 million years before the present. This unit helps keep the scale manageable when we're dealing with billions of years of history.
The GTS is organized like a hierarchy. The broadest grouping shown here is a supereon, then eons, then eras, then periods, and finally epochs. Think of it like folders within folders. Each step down gives you a finer resolution view of Earth's history, letting geologists talk about both huge transitions and more detailed phases within them.
At the eon level, Earth history is commonly divided into four major eons: the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and Phanerozoic. The first three, Hadean, Archean, and Proterozoic, are often grouped together as the Precambrian supereon. That Precambrian span covers most of Earth's existence, long before abundant animal fossils become common.
Here's a big picture map of the Precambrian supereon, running from about 4.5 billion years ago to 541 million years ago. It contains three eons: the Hadean from 4.5 to 4.0 billion years ago, the Archean from 4.0 to 2.5 billion years ago, and the Proterozoic from 2.5 billion years ago to 541 million years ago. Notice the mix of BYA and MYA. Both are just time before present units, but at different scales. The Hadean eon spans roughly 4,540 to 4,000 million years ago. This is the earliest chapter of Earth history, often pictured as a much hotter, more chaotic planet. In this source material, the key point is its placement in time range. It's the first eon, and it belongs to the Precambrian supereon.
Next is the Archean eon, from 4,000 to 2,500 million years ago. Two headline ideas matter here. First, this is when we see early evidence for life, including cyanobacteria by about 3,500 million years ago. Second, many of the oldest rock formations we can still see exposed at Earth's surface today date back to the Archean.
During the Archean, life existed, but it was simple. The material highlights cyanobacteria evidence around 3,500 MIA. These early organisms were prokaryotes, single-celled life forms that lack a nucleus. So unlike modern plants and animals, there's no complex multicellular life here. It's microscopic biology dominating the planet.
The Archean environment was very different from today's. The atmosphere lacked oxygen, and the source notes atmospheric pressure could have been around 10 to 100 atmospheres, far higher than modern sea level pressure. The oceans were also more acidic, largely because carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater. And the comparison is important. The Archean oceans were more acidic than they would be later in the Proterozoic. Geologically, the Archean marks a cooling and stabilization of Earth's outer shell. The crust cooled enough that continents could form. That's why many of the oldest exposed rocks we can study are Archean in age. The source also notes that by the end of the Archean, plate tectonics may have started to resemble the modern system, meaning large moving plates, recycling crust, and long-term reshaping of the surface.
After the Archean comes the Proterozoic eon, spanning roughly 2,500 million years ago to about 550 million years ago in this material. For now, treat it as the bridge between Earth's earliest history and the later time when animal fossils become much more common. We'll use this placement to connect the Precambrian world to the Phanerozoic world that follows.
Now we enter the Phanerozoic eon, from about 550 million years ago to the present. A key biological shift is that the first fossils of animals appear in this broad interval. But it's also emphasized that life remained mostly microscopic until the Cambrian explosion, around 541 million years ago, an interval famous for the rapid appearance of many animal groups in the fossil record.
The Phanerozoic also includes major tectonic reorganizations. One of the biggest is the formation of Pangaea, a supercontinent where most landmasses were joined. Later, Pangaea breaks apart into two major pieces, Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south. These continental shifts matter because they reshape climates, ocean circulation, habitats, and evolutionary pathways.
Structurally, the Phanerozoic eon is divided into three eras: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, and each of these eras is further subdivided into periods, 12 periods in total across the Phanerozoic. This layered organization is what lets geologists talk precisely about when major transitions happened.
The Paleozoic era runs from about 550 million years ago to 250 million years ago. The source characterizes it as an era strongly associated with arthropods, amphibians, and fishes, and it's also when life makes a crucial move onto land. That transition to land sets the stage for later terrestrial ecosystems and the evolution of many land-adapted groups. The Mesozoic era spans 250 million to 66 million years ago. It's widely known as the Age of the Dinosaurs, and the key theme is the rise and dominance of reptiles. Within the Mesozoic, we'll focus on its three periods: Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, because each has distinct evolutionary and environmental milestones.
The Triassic period runs from 250 to 200 million years ago. It's described as a transitional time, coming after the devastating Permian extinction and leading into the more lush conditions of the Jurassic. The Triassic is divided into three epochs: Early Triassic from 250 to 247 million years ago, Middle Triassic from 247 to 237 million years ago, and Late Triassic from 237 to 200 million years ago. In the early Triassic, deserts dominated Pangaea. Because Pangaea was still intact, its interior regions were far from ocean moisture sources, making them especially arid. This is a great example of how continental configuration, one big landmass versus separated continents, can strongly influence climate patterns. During the Middle Triassic, the breakup of Pangaea begins. As rifting starts, new ocean basins and seaways can develop. The material specifically mentions the beginning of the Tethys Sea, an important oceanic region that would influence marine circulation and provide new habitats for marine life. In the late Triassic, the first true dinosaurs evolved. The source also points to dinosaurs and pterosaurs as notable groups in this broader interval, pterosaurs being flying reptiles. This sets up the Mesozoic story. Reptiles diversify into many forms on land, in the air, and in the oceans. At the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic, the material highlights a major extinction event, identified here as the fourth mass extinction. Climatic change led to a large die-out, and notably, all large amphibians became extinct. The explanation emphasizes multiple stressors building to a tipping point: gradual climate change, sea level fluctuations, and ocean acidification. A proposed mechanism is massive volcanic eruptions, which can drive warning through gases like carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide, or drive cooling through aerosols that reflect sunlight.
The Jurassic period spans 200 to 145 million years ago and is divided into three epochs: Early Jurassic from 200 to 175 million years ago, Middle Jurassic from 175 to 163 million years ago, and Late Jurassic from 163 to 145 million years ago. This period is often associated with major reptile diversity and dominance, and the epoch-level details help pinpoint specific evolutionary developments mentioned in the material.
In the early Jurassic, the first true crocodiles evolved. Ecologically, that matters because it coincides with large amphibians being pushed to near extinction, suggesting competition and changing environments. The first true mammals also evolved in this epoch, but the source emphasizes how small they were. They didn't exceed the height of a shrew, meaning mammals existed but were not yet dominant in size or ecological role. The Middle Jurassic, from 175 to 163 million years ago, is described as the peak of the reptiles. Interpreting that, reptiles were exceptionally diverse and ecologically dominant, occupying many niches on land, and likely reflecting stable, favorable conditions for their continued expansion during this time. In the late Jurassic, from 163 to 145 million years ago, the material notes the separation of Pangaea into Laurasia and Gondwana. That tectonic breakup reshapes coastlines and climates. The source also mentions an extinction associated with the Jurassic-Cretaceous transition, signaling that the boundary between these periods includes significant biological turnover. The Cretaceous period runs from 145 to 66 million years ago. In this material, it's divided into two epochs: the Early Cretaceous from 145 to 100 MYA, and the Late Cretaceous from 100 to 65 MYA. This period includes major evolutionary developments, especially involving birds and flowering plants, and it ends with a famous mass extinction.
In the early Cretaceous, the first true birds evolved. The source suggests this may have sparked competition between birds and pterosaurs. That's a useful evolutionary idea. When a new group appears with similar lifestyles, like flight, it can compete for food, nesting sites, and ecological space, potentially reshaping which groups thrive. In the late Cretaceous, global cooling is highlighted as a driver that restricted tropical ecology closer to the equator. Alongside these climate patterns, the material notes key evolutionary developments. Marsupials evolved, and the first flowering plants evolved. Flowering plants in particular would later transform terrestrial ecosystems by changing food webs and creating new co-evolutionary relationships with pollinators. At 66 million years ago, the Cretaceous ends with the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, also called the KPG extinction, and historically the KT extinction. The source attributes severe environmental stress to major volcanism, especially the Deccan traps and other eruptions, poisoning the atmosphere, and also to a large meteor impact that formed the Chicxulub crater on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Together, these events drove rapid, global-scale disruption. The material describes dramatic consequences. It states that every living thing with a body mass over 10 kilograms became extinct, and that the age of the dinosaurs ended. Afterward, many groups underwent adaptive radiation, meaning a sudden and prolific diversification into new forms and species. Mammals diversified in the Paleogene, producing lineages such as horses, whales, bats, and primates. The source also notes that birds, fish, and perhaps lizards radiated as well, filling ecological roles that had been opened up by the extinction.
The Cenozoic era extends from about 65 million years ago to the present. The key theme given is the rise of mammals. After the KPG extinction, mammals were able to expand into many niches, increase in body size in many lineages, and become a dominant feature of many terrestrial ecosystems. Within the Cenozoic, the material highlights the Quaternary period, from 2.58 million years ago to the present. The Quaternary is divided into two epochs, the Pleistocene and the Holocene. This is the part of the timeline most directly connected to recent climate cycles and the evolution and spread of modern humans. The Pleistocene runs from 2.58 million years ago to about 11,700 years ago. It's marked by ice ages tied to a broader cooling trend that the source says began back in the mid-Eocene. The material also points out major regional climate impacts, especially in Africa, where increasing dryness or desiccation contributed to the formation and expansion of major deserts, the Sahara, the Namib, and the Kalahari. The Pleistocene is also notable for the evolution and presence of many animals, including mammoths, dire wolves, and most famously, Homo sapiens. As the Pleistocene drew to a close, the source notes a major extinction that wiped out much of the world's megafauna. It also included the loss of some hominid species, such as Neanderthals, highlighting that human evolution is intertwined with these late Quaternary environmental shifts. Here's a UPSC Prelims 2014 style question. Which phenomena might have influenced the evolution of organisms? Continental drift, glacial cycles, both, or neither? Use what we've discussed. Drifting continents rearrange habitats and climates over long timescales, and glacial cycles repeatedly reshape environments and selection pressures. Keep this question in mind, and we'll connect it even more clearly as we continue. The Holocene begins about 11,700 years ago and continues to the present. It follows the end of the last major glacial phase and represents the most recent slice of Earth history, short on the geological scale, but extremely important for understanding modern climates, ecosystems, and the context in which human societies developed. The Hadean Eon runs from about 4.54 to 4.0 billion years ago, and it's essentially Earth's earliest chapter, before we have a reliable fossil record of life. The key idea is that the planet was incredibly hot. Earth was being battered by frequent collisions, volcanism was intense, and there were abundant short-lived radioactive elements producing extra heat. Put all that together, and much of Earth's surface was molten or close to it, which makes this period very different from the more stable world we're used to imagining. A major event in the Hadean is the proposed formation of the Moon. The leading explanation is the giant impact hypothesis. A planet-sized body called Theia collided with the early Earth around 4.5 billion years ago. The impact would have blasted enormous amounts of material into orbit, and that debris is thought to have accreted, meaning clumped together under gravity, to form the Moon. This also fits with the idea that the early Earth-Moon system experienced a lot of energetic, chaotic conditions. After the Moon formed, it was heavily affected by what's called the late heavy bombardment, sometimes called the lunar cataclysm, around 4 billion years ago. The idea is that there was a spike, a disproportionately large number of asteroid impacts. The Moon is especially useful here because it preserves craters so well, no plate tectonics and little erosion compared to Earth. So the Moon's cratered surface acts like a historical record of this intense bombardment. Importantly, the late heavy bombardment wasn't just a Moon-only event. During the LHB phase, a large number of asteroids are theorized to have collided with the early terrestrial planets across the inner solar system: Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. That matters because repeated impacts can melt crust, reset surface geology, and deliver or remove volatile compounds. So the LHB is often treated as a major environmental stressor,
and possibly a major ingredient supplier for early planetary surfaces. As Earth began to cool from its earliest molten state, volcanic outgassing likely created the primordial atmosphere and then helped create the oceans. Outgassing means gases trapped inside Earth escaped through volcanoes. The early atmosphere contained almost no oxygen, which is a huge contrast with today. Instead, it was likely dominated by carbon dioxide, along with hydrogen and lots of water vapor. As temperatures dropped, water vapor could condense and fall as rain, gradually accumulating into oceans. Over time, cooling allowed a solid crust to form, but cooling doesn't mean everything became calm immediately. Hot volatiles were still being released and circulating. The result described here is a dense atmosphere, especially rich in carbon dioxide, along with hydrogen and water vapor. This matters because atmospheric composition controls surface pressure and temperature, and those two factors strongly affect whether water can exist as liquid, ice, or gas.
One of the most counterintuitive points is that liquid water oceans could exist even with a surface temperature around 230 degrees Celsius. How? Pressure. If atmospheric pressure is high enough, here above about 27 atmospheres, water's boiling point increases dramatically. A heavy carbon dioxide atmosphere would raise surface pressure, making it possible for water to remain liquid at temperatures far above 100 degrees Celsius. So temperature alone doesn't decide water's state. Pressure is the other half of the story.
As Earth continued cooling and oceans persisted, carbon dioxide didn't just stay in the air. CO2 dissolves into water, so the ocean can act like a sink that pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. Over long timescales, that process can reduce atmospheric CO2 substantially. This is an early example of how the atmosphere and oceans are coupled. Changes in one reservoir can drive big changes in the other. The material asks a great physics question. Can water boil at room temperature? Yes, it can, if you decrease the ambient pressure. Boiling isn't defined by reaching 100 degrees Celsius. It's defined by the liquid's vapor pressure matching the surrounding pressure. Lower the surrounding pressure enough, and water can boil even when it's cool. Here's the intuition. At lower pressure, there are fewer gas molecules pushing back on molecules trying to escape the liquid. So when water molecules evaporate from the surface, they meet less resistance and enter the air more easily. That's why decreasing ambient pressure lowers the boiling point. And the reverse is also true. Increasing pressure raises the boiling point, which is exactly the logic used earlier to explain hot but liquid Hadean oceans. Jumping forward, the Proterozoic eon spans roughly 2.5 billion to 550 million years ago, and it's the last eon of the Precambrian. Biologically, it's a turning point. Bacteria begin producing oxygen, and eukaryotes, cells with a nucleus, emerge. The material also notes the appearance of some soft-bodied multicellular organisms, including forms like corals. So the Proterozoic is where Earth's biosphere becomes more complex and more chemically transformative.
Geologically, the Proterozoic was very tectonically active. It featured the first definitive supercontinent cycles, continents assembling into a giant landmass and later breaking apart. It also featured modern-style orogeny, meaning mountain building through plate interactions like collisions and subduction. A major point here is that most of the modern continental crust was formed during the Proterozoic, so a lot of the stable platforms continents sit on today have roots in this eon.
The dominant supercontinent highlighted for the Proterozoic is Rodinia, dated roughly from about 1,000 to 750 million years ago. The key takeaway isn't just the name, it's what it represents. By this time, plate tectonics had organized continents into large-scale configurations that strongly influenced ocean circulation, climate, and the habitats available for evolving life.
The Proterozoic may also have included dramatic global glaciations, often described as snowball Earth episodes, possibly in both early and late phases of the eon. The idea is that temperatures dropped below freezing on a planetary scale, ice sheets expanded extensively, and sea levels fell as water became locked up as ice. These events would have been enormous environmental filters, reshaping ecosystems and the chemistry of the oceans and atmosphere.
The snowball Earth hypothesis is stated very directly. Earth's surface became entirely or nearly entirely frozen at least once, sometime earlier than about 650 million years ago. It's called a hypothesis because it's an explanatory framework supported by multiple lines of evidence, and scientists test it by comparing predictions, like glacial deposits in unusual places, with the rock record. Now into the Paleozoic era, from about 550 to 250 million years ago. This era is broken into 6 periods: Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian. Across these periods, the big themes are diversification, especially in the oceans early on, followed by major transitions onto land, and several mass extinctions that repeatedly reshaped life. The Cambrian period is famous for the Cambrian explosion, described here as the greatest number of creatures evolving in a single period in Earth's history. Marine ecosystems diversified dramatically. Algae, plant-like organisms, were present, and arthropods became especially dominant. A key biological milestone is that almost all marine phyla, meaning the major body plan groups in the ocean, evolved during this period. In the Ordovician, many groups that are still familiar today evolved, including primitive fish and corals, but the most common forms of life in many marine settings were trilobites, snails, and shellfish. The big transition highlighted is that the first arthropods crept ashore. That's a major step toward terrestrial ecosystems, early small-scale land colonization beginning to take shape. By the end of the Ordovician, the supercontinent Gondwana had shifted from near the equator toward the South Pole. That movement set the stage for glaciation on Gondwana. When large ice sheets grow, sea level drops because water is stored as ice on land. The material emphasizes that this sea level fall killed off life along coastlines and contributed to a snowball Earth-like cooling, culminating in the Ordovician-Silurian extinction event. The Ordovician-Silurian extinction is labeled here as the first mass extinction, and it's described as the second deadliest in Earth's history. The strongest impacts were on marine communities. The likely driving agents given are the lowering of sea level and glacially driven cooling. So the mechanism is tightly tied to climate and ocean habitat loss, especially the collapse of shallow coastal environments where many species lived. A more detailed explanation is also provided for why cooling may have intensified. The material says a fall in atmospheric carbon dioxide preceded the late Ordovician glaciation. That CO2 dip is correlated with volcanic activity that deposited new silicate rocks. As silicate rocks erode, chemical weathering can draw CO2 out of the air. With less CO2, greenhouse warming weakens, making global cooling and glaciation more likely. It's a good example of how geology can drive climate through the carbon cycle. During the Silurian period, the material emphasizes the continental layout. It lists 4 continents: Gondwana, made up of what would become Africa, South America, Australia, Antarctica, and India, plus Laurentia, which corresponds to North America with parts of Europe, Baltica, described as the rest of Europe, and Siberia, representing Northern Asia. This arrangement matters because continental positions influence ocean currents, climate zones, and where shallow seas form.
The Devonian is often called the age of the fishes, and the reason is a huge diversification of fish. The material also highlights major land innovations. Plant groups diversified, the first trees evolved, and the first seeds appeared, key steps toward more complex terrestrial ecosystems. It also notes the first amphibians evolving, linking aquatic and terrestrial life. In this period, fish are described as being at the top of the food chain in many environments.
Near the end of the Devonian, the late Devonian extinction occurred, and the material states that about 70% of all species became extinct. The proposed causes include changes in sea level and ocean anoxia, meaning a lack of oxygen in ocean waters. The anoxia may have been triggered by global cooling or by oceanic volcanism. Either way, it points to large-scale disruption of marine chemistry and habitats.
In the Carboniferous, tropical swamps dominated large parts of Earth. With extensive forests and lots of plant growth, huge amounts of organic carbon accumulated. When that plant material was buried and altered over geologic time, it formed coal deposits, hence the name Carboniferous, meaning coal-bearing. This period is a great example of how biology can reshape Earth's geology by changing what gets stored in sediments.
Another key Carboniferous development is the evolution of amniotic eggs. The material explains that this allowed amphibians to move farther inland because reproduction became less tied to water. The amniotic egg includes amniotic fluid, a clear, slightly yellowish liquid surrounding the fetus, which helps protect and support development. This is one of the major adaptations that eventually supports the success of reptiles and later groups on dry land. Climate-wise, the Carboniferous is described as having an overall cooling pattern. Eventually, this cooling contributed to the glaciation of Gondwana, especially because much of Gondwana was situated around the South Pole. So again, we see the connection between plate tectonics, where continents sit, and climate, because polar positioning makes large ice sheets much more likely. At the beginning of the Permian, all continents assembled into the supercontinent Pangaea, surrounded by a single vast ocean called Panthalassa. The material emphasizes that Earth was very dry during this time, with harsh seasons. A key reason is that when you have a huge supercontinent, the interior is far from the moderating influence of oceans, so temperatures and precipitation can swing more extremely. Biologically on land, the Permian saw the first conifers evolved, and then conifers came to dominate many terrestrial landscapes. Reptiles flourished in the new dry climate, since they're generally better adapted to drier conditions than amphibians. The material specifically mentions Scutosaurus and Gorgonopsids as animals that filled parts of this arid landmass, illustrating how ecosystems were changing under the Pangaea climate. The Permian ends with the most devastating biological crisis in Earth history, the event often called the Great Dying. The material states that about 95% of all life on Earth disappeared. This is presented as the world's third mass extinction event, and the largest in its history. It's the kind of reset that restructures ecosystems from the ground up, both in the oceans and on land. The Permian-Triassic extinction, often abbreviated PT, is described as Earth's most severe known extinction event. The numbers are staggering. Up to 96% of marine species went extinct, and about 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. The material also notes it is the only known mass extinction of insects, which highlights just how broadly the crisis affected life across different environments. The material lists several suggested causes for the Permian-Triassic extinction. One is large meteor impact events. Another is massive volcanism, especially the Siberian Traps, an enormous volcanic province that could have released vast amounts of gases. A third idea is a runaway greenhouse effect triggered by sudden methane release from the seafloor, potentially linked to methane-producing microbes called methanogens. These mechanisms aren't mutually exclusive. In many extinction discussions, multiple stressors can combine to push ecosystems past a tipping point. Moving to the Cenozoic era, from about 65 million years ago to the present, the defining theme given is the rise of mammals as the dominant class of animals.
The Cenozoic is divided into three major parts: the Paleogene, the Neogene, and the Quaternary. From here, we'll walk through what the material highlights in each of these intervals. The Paleogene period runs from about 66 to 23 million years ago. The material breaks it into three epochs: the Paleocene, the Eocene, and the Oligocene. Keeping these names straight helps because each epoch is associated with different climate patterns, continental configurations, and evolutionary expansions, especially among mammals.
In the Paleocene, the continents began taking on more modern shapes, but they were still separated from each other. The Tethys Sea is described as separating Afro-Eurasia, and the Americas were separated by the Strait of Panama because the Isthmus of Panama had not yet formed. These geographic barriers matter because they control ocean circulation and also limit or enable animal migrations between land masses. Climate in the Paleocene is described as generally warming, to the point that jungles eventually reached the poles. In the oceans, sharks dominated, especially after the extinction of the large reptiles that had previously been major marine predators. This combination, warm climates and reorganized food webs, sets the stage for mammal diversification on land and continued evolution in marine ecosystems. Even though the Cenozoic is known for mammals, the Paleocene didn't start with giant mammals everywhere. The material notes mammals were still quite small. Meanwhile, enormous crocodiles and large snakes were top predators in many environments. So early Cenozoic ecosystems could look very different from the later mammal-dominated scenes people often imagine. In the Eocene, the material emphasizes that conditions allowed mammals to grow larger. Some lineages expanded dramatically in size, and whales are specifically mentioned as reaching mammoth proportions. This reflects both ecological opportunity and environmental conditions that supported large-bodied animals, including rich marine food webs for large marine mammals. The Oligocene is described as a time of global grass expansion. That shift toward more open habitats created new opportunities, and many new species evolved to take advantage of them. The material lists the first elephants, as well as cats, dogs, marsupials, and many other groups still prevalent today. So changing vegetation, like the spread of grasslands, can drive major evolutionary change by creating new niches. A standout Oligocene animal mentioned is Paraceratherium. It's described as the largest land mammal to ever live, and it evolved during this epoch. Including an example like this helps anchor the idea that mammal evolution in the Cenozoic wasn't just about diversity. It was also about pushing body size to extremes under the right ecological conditions. Next is the Neogene period, spanning about 23.03 to 2.58 million years ago. The material divides it into two epochs, the Miocene and the Pliocene. This is a time when geography and climate continue shifting toward modern patterns, and those shifts strongly influence habitats and migrations. In the Miocene, the Tethys Sea finally closed with the creation of the Arabian Peninsula. The material notes that in its wake it left the Black, Red, Mediterranean, and Caspian Seas. A key climatic consequence mentioned is increased aridity, generally drier conditions, because changing seaways can alter moisture transport and ocean circulation patterns. The Pliocene is described as a time of climatic changes that brought expanding savannas across the world. The material also highlights the development or strengthening of Indian monsoons, deserts forming in East Asia, and the beginnings of the Sahara Desert. These are big reorganizations of climate zones, and they reshape where forests, grasslands, and deserts exist, directly affecting which animals and plants can thrive. Another major Pliocene event is the formation of the Isthmus of Panama. Once that land bridge formed, animals could migrate between North and South America.
This kind of connection can trigger major ecological change because species that evolved separately suddenly compete, prey on each other, or spread into new habitats.
By the later Neogene, the material says Earth's continents and seas moved into their present shapes. It also notes the world map has not changed much since then, except for changes brought about by quaternary glaciations. One example given is the formation of features like the Great Lakes. So the big tectonic rearrangements slow down, and climate-driven surface changes become more prominent. The Pliocene also includes an evolutionary milestone for humans. Australopithecus evolved in Africa. The material frames this as the beginning of the human branch. The key point is not that modern humans appear here, but that the lineage leading toward humans is clearly underway, with early hominins adapting to the changing environments of the time. Finally, the Holocene runs from about 11,700 years ago to the present. The material emphasizes that all recorded history, what people often mean by the history of the world, fits inside the Holocene. This is also the interval when human activity becomes increasingly influential on ecosystems, especially as societies grow and technologies expand. The material also raises a modern and important claim. Human activity is blamed for a mass extinction that began roughly 10,000 years ago. It notes that the species becoming extinct have only been recorded since the Industrial Revolution, which makes sense. Record-keeping and scientific monitoring expand dramatically in that period. This ongoing biodiversity loss is sometimes referred to as the sixth extinction, connecting today's changes to the pattern of past mass extinctions in Earth history.
To wrap up, notice the repeating patterns. Early Earth is dominated by heat, impacts, and atmosphere-ocean chemistry, where pressure can be just as important as temperature. The Proterozoic brings oxygen and complex cells, alongside major tectonic cycles and extreme climate events. The Paleozoic shows rapid diversification, the move onto land, and several mass extinctions that reset life. The Cenozoic highlights mammal dominance and the way geography, like closing seas and forming land bridges, drives climate and migration. And in the Holocene, humans become a major driver of change, with biodiversity loss sometimes framed as a sixth mass extinction.